Hello, I'm Nhaaj. I'm a T4 analyst in Rainbow Six Siege, so basically, my opinion just doesn't matter. But fuck you, I'm gonna spout my nonsense anyway.
Finding a second. Can you just do this by brute force? What? Not me!
The EUL, or Blast R6 European League, is a tournament where a set number of teams, 9 in this case, compete to earn SI or 6 invitational points in their cut of the prize pool to show their stature within their specific region. The regional leagues, like EUL, are generally split into a group stage and a playoff stage. This usually splits 10 teams into 2 groups of 5 who then compete against each other in a rotary format, with each team facing each opponent in their group once before playoffs. The basic rundown of the rules is as follows. Each team competes in a single match on whatever map they end up with after the map bans. They then go head to head in 2 6-round halves to see who can be the first to reach 7-round wins. Once this is reached, the team with 7 rounds won wins the match and secures 3 points for that match, commonly referred to as a regulation win, whilst the loser gains nothing. However, there is an exception to this rule. If both teams equalise at 6-6, then we enter overtime, commonly referred to as OT. At this point, the win condition changes from 7 to 8 rounds, and the teams will switch sides after each completed round. In this case, the winner gains 2 points and the loser gains 1. SI points are earned from Blast R6 events and leagues in order to qualify as one of the top 20 teams in the world which attend the 6 Invitational tournament at the end of the cycle of major events and 2 league stages. This makes winning, or at least placing highly, in the regional leagues extremely worthwhile for teams looking to prove their worth at the precipice of international play. Alongside this, money. In the 2 stages of EUL that took place last year, we saw pretty mixed results from teams we expected to do very well, and an overwhelming performance from a returning Russian roster that had been outcasted from the game at a professional level because of certain sanctions that heavily affected Russian organisations, causing an inability for them to play at an official regulated level. In Stage 1, the talk of the town and the big titans of the league were G2, coming in off of the back of winning the 6 Invitational 2023 event. They came to their first match firing on all cylinders, beating out another formidable roster known as BDS, who had up until the 2023 Invitational been on a winning streak of 2 EUL finals and 2 major events. On the second playday, however, G2 faced Virtus Pro, the Russian team that I alluded to earlier on, eventually losing 8-6 in a nail-biting overtime match. The other teams in their group, Heroic and TT9, were the 2 teams expected to end up at the bottom of the tables. And in the case of TT9, that was correct, placing last with only a single point to their name. Heroic, however, managed to tie for 3rd/4th place with BDS on both points and round difference, only then beating out BDS on a technicality, which I can honestly only assume is because they had beaten BDS in the match they played within their group. This caused BDS to not gain any SI points for this stage, and also not make it into the EUL Stage 1 playoffs. This will be important later. The other group in Stage 1 of the 2023 EUL, consisting of Wild, M&M, Team Secret, Koi and Wolves, was a complete shitfest for analytical predictions, as 2 of the teams expected to do well ended up at the bottom of their group. These teams were Koi and Wolves. Koi only managed to find a single overtime win against Wolves, earning themselves 2 points, and Wolves only managed to earn 2 points from 2 separate overtime losses. M&M, however, on the other hand, were the other team expected to do well in this group, and as we anticipated, they ended up placing 2nd, only losing out to Wild on a 7-5 loss on Playday 3. Wild and Secret, while they are 2 relatively well-respected and consistent teams, though not particularly spectacular rosters in recent history, ended the groups phase of the first stage in 1st and 3rd respectively, with M&M taking the 2nd place spot, only suffering a loss in 1 game against Wild, who ended their group phase in 1st place. In the playoffs, the 2 first place teams in their respective groups, G2 for Group A and Wild for Group B, both automatically advanced to the upper bracket semi-finals, and the 2nd place teams of each group placed the 3rd place teams of the opposing group, leading to a concise win for each of the 2nd place teams, with M&M winning 2-0 in a best of 3 map series against Heroic, and Virtus Pro mirroring that performance in their own game against Team Secret. In the semi-finals, we saw G2, who placed first in Group A, face off against M&M, who placed second in Group B. In what was probably the most one-sided affair of the entire playoffs bracket, going in favour of G2. The other matchup, however, between Wild, who placed first in Group B, and Virtus.pro, who placed second in Group A, ended up being an extremely close matchup, ending in a reverse sweep, with Virtus.pro winning the final 2 maps of the best of 3, narrowly avoiding overtime in the second map. Before we discuss the finals between Virtus.pro and G2, the third place decider game took place between the semi-finals losers, Wild and M&M. This match was another extremely close and enticing game, ending in another reverse sweep that once again fell out of Wild's favour after they convincingly took the first map. And then, the finals. The game took place, and G2, the Titans of the European League, faced off against the formidable returning Russians of Virtus.pro. In map 1, we saw a strong performance from Virtus.pro, winning 7-4 on Bank for a devastating loss to G2 in the second map of Skyscraper, which is considered to be G2's best map within the pool at this point. Finally, the teams faced off on Oregon, a map that's considered to be one of the most fundamental maps in the pool, as of it being one of the longest standing included maps in the competitive map pools. G2, the explosive Titans, started out on defense and showed their skills with a dominant round 1 before entering into a much slower round 2 with back and forth trades in the final minute, before an eventual clutch victory by Doki on Clash. Unfortunately for G2 though, this was where their dominance in the first half seemed to fade, with Virtus.pro being able to win the next 4 rounds back to back, semi-convincingly, with their patient and methodical approach to the game, allowing them to just adapt and take advantage of G2's positioning and utility usage. In the second half, with Virtus.pro on the defense, they managed to secure another round, equating to 5 in a row and then 1 more, eventually leaving Virtus.pro on match point in regulation, where they would remain for the next 2 rounds before eventually taking the map in a 7-4 regulation victory. The ending of Blast EUL Stage 1 granted Virtus.pro 150 SI points for their first place finish, G2 130 for theirs in second, and M&M 115 for their finish in third, starting them off strong in the point standings, eventually leading up to potentially ending up in the top 20 teams in the standings of SI that qualified to the Invitational after Blast EUL Stage 2. Prior to Stage 2 of the Blast European League, we saw the Blast R6 Copenhagen Major. This was split into 3 phases. The play-ins, which contained 16 teams divided into 4 groups, each faced with a small double elimination bracket format best of 1 to inevitably decide 2 teams from each group to eventually qualify to the second phase. The Swiss phase, which shockingly enough revolves around the Swiss system, which is a method of play that is intended to halve the 16 remaining teams into a much more manageable 8, to take into the final phase of the event. The Swiss system mostly pertains to the best of 1 format that took place in the previous phase of the Major, only this time placing teams in matches based on seeding, either through first phase or qualifying through their respective regional leagues. In this format, each team will play a minimum of 3 matches and a maximum of 6, depending on the performance of the teams. Once a team wins 3 matches, then they qualify to phase 3 of the event. However, if they lose 3 matches, then they will be knocked out of the event. Though, to get to that point, they will have to not only lose 2 best of 1 matches, but also a best of 3 knockout match. The remaining 8 teams then face off in a single elimination bracket in phase 3 to eventually decide the winner, participating in best of 3 matches until the eventual best of 5 final. The teams involved in the tournament for the European side were G2, Virtus.pro, M&M, and Wolves. G2 and Virtus.pro being the only European rosters to qualify past the first phase of the Major due to their performance in the Stage 1 of EUL. Wolves and M&M both limped their way through phase 1, both of them barely able to make their way through in the lower bracket. Wolves played their first game against Farrell, an internationally unproven Japanese roster, which were attempting to showcase their talent in their first T1 international showing. Wolves, however, cleared themselves easily, 7-3 finish, on Clubhouse with a concise 5-1 first half. Though, this all kind of went to shit. In their second match, where they faced the rising stars of W7M from Brazil, who absolutely flattened the Wolves on the same map, 7-4. Wolves, now in the lower bracket of their own double elimination group, were left in a do-or-die position, facing off against none other than Varel once again, who had just managed to win a 2-1 best-of-3 against the likes of Team Bliss, who will become more of an important factor in this story later on. But Wolves quickly dispatched Varel once again, pushing through to qualification to Stage 2 with an easy 2-0 in the best-of-3 match. M&M, however, played their first game in the double elimination groups format against a team from the newly established MENA minor region called Falcons. Falcons were expected to be an absolute powerhouse, with their first international showing being at Gamers 8 2022, where they relatively easily beat the likes of MIBR, TSM and Wild. Needless to say, M&M lost this match, barely managing to maintain a respectable 7-5 scoreline against the MENA monster squad. Though, once in the lower bracket, M&M were out for blood, seeking vengeance for the injustice they faced against the other teams that stood in their way. First competing against Fury in an extremely close 2-1 victory, before easily dispatching Sandbox Gaming, who were the very team who put Fury in the lower bracket, in order for M&M to prove their worth and qualify for Phase 2. After this though, Phase 2 started, and while Wolves and Virtus.pro were the only two of the 4 European teams to win their first match, they were also the 2 European teams to get knocked out. Both of these teams playing the full 6 matches, and at least proving that they aren't going down without a fight. A feeble fight, but a fight nonetheless. G2 claimed 3rd overall in Phase 2, and M&M barely squeaked through an 8th. G2 had the best run of the European teams, starting with a 7-3 loss against SSG.
What?
SSG?
Which weren't a particularly impressive team at this tournament. Even though their placement was 10th, I would easily argue that they were one of the worst teams from the Phase 2 lineup, at least from their performance at this event. After this loss though, G2 came back swinging, beating out their region's very own M&M in a very close best-of-1 match before moving on to Team Liquid, dominating them in a quick 7-3 best-of-1 victory. Finally, they had one team standing in their way. A team that had already beaten them back in the EUL finals, and one of the favourites for this phase of the event, Virtus.pro. Their match began on Cafe Dostoyevsky, where they went on a relatively default 4-2 half on defense, which really set an air of suspense throughout the entire European viewer base, before winning 3 rounds in a row to secure a near-flawless victory at 7-2 against the very roster that costed them the EUL title.
Go get some snacks!
M&M, after placing 3rd in EUL, faced off against one of the 2 rosters from Brazil that was currently dominating R6 on an international stage, FaZe Clan. After a grueling 12 rounds, the game eventually grinded to a halt when FaZe were able to secure their 7th round win, ending the match 7-5. Disgruntled but not disheartened, they moved on to their second match, knowing full well their challenge wasn't up yet. This time, however, they faced G2. And while both teams fought tooth and nail to push for the sweet victory that lay ahead, we went to a maximum of 15 rounds, and the game eventually ended 8-7 in favour of G2, leaving M&M in a scary position. They now faced regulation dead in the eyes, being forced to face the harrowing nature of needing to win 3 best-of-3 matches in a row in order to qualify for Phase 3. In a mind-blowing turn of events, they were placed against Revan E-Club, one of the only teams to spell their name in all caps. Intimidating, right? Jokes aside, they were easily able to break through the armour of the LATAM squad, who were actually just 3 Brits, a Frenchie and an American playing under a LATAM-based organisation, but we move on. Next, M&M faced another huge hurdle, being faced with the highest rated North American roster to grace the event, M80. After coming out of the NAL with a first place finish, they were the next opponents, both teams facing relegation if they were to lose this game, and it kind of went
Very, very long.
After 30 rounds were played, in the first 2 maps alone, it was clear that neither of these 2 teams were going to relent to their opponent. The final map, Oregon, known fittingly as the Great Equalizer, was all that stood between the 2 teams, and a push towards that final best of 3 that they needed to qualify for Phase 3. M&M started the final map with an incredible 5-1 lead in the first half, though their lead quickly narrowed in the second half, with the map finally ending 7-5 in favour of M&M, pushing them into a final match against Virtus.pro to decide which of the two European rosters were going to make it through to the final phase of the Major. Though this game was not only expected to be close, but also to go in Virtus.pro's favour, it didn't exactly go as the Russians planned. The first map ended quickly in favour of M&M, with an easy 7-0 victory over the Russians on the French Alps of Chalet, before a relatively close 7-5 victory in favour of M&M once again, this time on Villa, and this finally decided M&M to qualify for Phase 3. For the European viewer base, Phase 3, or the playoff stage, was extremely underwhelming. G2 faced a relatively quick loss against Team Liquid in the quarterfinals and was soon followed by M&M, who had a much closer but just as disheartening loss against W7M. Both games needed 3 maps in their best of 3 format, but unfortunately for Europe, it just wasn't a bright day for us within International R6. With the Copenhagen Major over, R6 fans all over the world waited with bated breaths to finally see their teams rise again. And Group A of EUL was fucking stacked. The previous stage winners of Virtus.pro were pitted against the previous 4th place team of Wild and the previous 5th place team of Secret, alongside Koi and a rebranded TT9 now under the Into the Breach name. Secret started off their tour with an easy 7-4 victory over ITB, soon followed by the first 7-0 of this group by Wild against Koi. However, Day 2 got heated when we saw an extremely harrowing side of ITB, bringing their A-game to secure an 8-7 victory over Wild in an unexpected turn of events, to say the least. Virtus.pro also secured their first game against Secret with a 7-4 scoreline, mirroring what Secret did against ITB in Day 1. We went on to see Secret claw an 8-6 victory against Koi, with ITB securing back-to-back wins against the two teams no one expected them to topple. One of these teams was Virtus.pro. On the final day, Group A saw Wild secure a 7-0 victory over Secret and Virtus.pro with an 8-6 win over Koi. This ended the group with Virtus.pro in first, qualifying themselves immediately into the semi-finals Game 1 of Phase 2, with Wild and ITB qualifying for the quarters Game 1 and 2 respectively. But in Group B, the previously unsuccessful French powerhouses were back with a fucking vengeance. We started Day 1 as everyone expected, a 7-5 win for G2 against BDS, and a 7-4 win for M&M over Heroic. However, after this point we saw the tables turn exponentially. G2 were barely able to topple Heroic with an 8-7 scoreline, and Wolves thrashed M&M 7-4 in an immense upset game. Wolves went on to give G2 and Heroic the same treatment, with the games becoming less and less close as the days went on. BDS also went on to secure consecutive dominant wins against Heroic, M&M, and even the mighty Wolves themselves, in a head-on French Pro League style matchup on the final day of the group. This meant BDS were the Group B team to qualify for semi-finals, in the other match detached from Virtus.pro for now, with Wolves and M&M qualifying just behind them to face the quarters. The all-important playoffs phase for EUL Stage 2 commences, and for one team in particular, this is truly for all the marbles. M&M and Wild face off first in the quarterfinals Game 1 with a super close 2-0 win for M&M to move on and face BDS. Wolves and ITB play a game of tug-of-war, each team convincingly trading maps until Wolves win a devastating 7-1 on Skyscraper in the final map of the series, moving themselves forward to face Virtus.pro. Prior to that game though, BDS versus M&M commences, and we see the French powerhouse find a swift reverse sweep, taking the second map 7-1 before winning Skyscraper 7-4. Then, unsurprisingly, Wolves got battered 2-0 by Virtus.pro, leading us on to the fabled finals match, and as I said before, this is for all the marbles, specifically for BDS. After not making EUL Stage 1 playoffs, they need to secure first place in order to qualify for the 6th Invitational, the biggest major event of the year, where they would participate inside of the top 20 teams globally to decide who the true kings of R6 Pro League really are. Map 1 was Cafe Dostoevsky, a map renowned by BDS as a map that they can perform on. The scoreline was close, both teams trading rounds backwards and forwards until eventually Virtus.pro took the map 8-6. But when all fans had lost hope, Shaiko dropped 12 kills in a 7-1 clubhouse match and won Virtus.pro's map pick. Only one map remained between BDS and qualification for SI against these Russian titans, Oregon. The map of broken dreams, equalised games, and heavily reliant on mechanical skill. A map that Virtus.pro would go on to dominate, starting with a 5-1 first half that eventually ended 7-4.
Calm down. This is a very winnable position for Sandbox.
Yeah, it really is. And there's no cover really for Cons right now. He knows he's got one over here inside the kitchen, but the hatch is open. Very minimal time too. Little switch!
The Atlanta Major for R6 was a spectacle for the Brazilian region, stapling them as the most dominant region by far within the community. But that's not for us to focus on here. Instead, we're to overlook another disaster show from the Europeans, where we continue the recent trend of fucking fumbling playoffs. The groups phase of the Major once again followed 4 teams per group in a double elimination bracket, allowing 8 teams from the last chance qualifiers to move on to phase 2 of the Major. To start out, we saw G2 in Group C, and after an easy 7-3 victory they faced off against DZ, where after 2 completely even halves at 3-3 and 3-3 to end up with us a 6-6, G2 pulled ahead, dropping DZ into the lower bracket and securing themselves for qualification to Phase 2. In a much scarier run, however, was Wolves, who lost their first match 8-6 to Team Bliss, an Oceanic roster who were attending their second ever international event. After dropping to the lower bracket of their group, they faced off against Alpha Atheris, another extremely unproven roster, this time from LATAM, attending their first ever international T1 event. Needless to say, Wolves beat them quickly and seemingly without trouble. However, their second match was not going to nearly be as easy. They had once again one more best of 3, separating them from qualification, and the team that was in their way was none other than Team Bliss. Bliss started the matchup with a quick and convincing 7-2 on map 1. The European fans, though not particularly upset by this because we all wanted this new roster to do well, were still a little shook by the dominant performance by Bliss in this first map. Upon the start of the second map, we saw a closer game, with Wolves relatively convincingly taking the second map 7-4. One map separated Wolves from relegation and qualification. In what was probably the most tense and fun match of the entire tournament, we saw constant trading of rounds, before eventually seeing Wolves take the match in a maximum overtime to secure their qualification to Phase 2.
Oh, that was sweet! Lucy's back up!
No, he's not.
He's back
Oh my
up!
God,
He
he
revived
is.
himself with the finger! He doesn't know! The wraparound
In Phase
works!
2 of the Atlanta Major, we once again only saw 2 teams from the European region qualify to Phase 3, of the 4 that actually qualified for Phase 2. G2 had a flawless run, ending Phase 2 in a dominant fashion, winning 3 games in a row in regulation. The other team to qualify was BDS, who had been through a much tougher run throughout this phase of the Major, starting out with a 7-2 win versus SSG, and they eventually ended up against 2 performing rosters throughout this tournament, being GK and W7M, losing each game 7-3 and 7-5 respectively. In a last-ditch effort to qualify, facing relegation dead in the eyes, BDS had to beat 2 teams in best-of-3 matchups to move forward in this event. The first of which was Sonics, a roster that had a lot of promise but not a lot of results on the international stage to back it up. The series began with a heartbreaking 8-7 loss inside of map 1 before BDS eventually found their footing, securing a 7-4, 7-5 reverse sweep in the remaining 2 maps. Their final matchup, however, was the scariest of the lot. The team that stood before them was none other than Virtus.pro. The very team that denied BDS first place inside of EUL Stage 2. And the team that faced relegation alongside them. However, after what was probably the longest 2-0 best of 3 we've ever seen on an international stage, BDS found an 8-6 and 8-7 overtime win on both of the first 2 maps, securing their position in the third phase of the major. However, once again, Europe did an Amber Heard and shit the bed. Based on seeding, the 2 teams from Europe to qualify to Phase 3 ended up facing each other first, meaning only one of them could continue throughout the tournament. And G2 were on their revenge tour, firing on every cylinder imaginable to beat BDS in a convincing 2-0 best of 3 matchup before eventually fumbling a win against W7M in semis. The 6 Invitational, the most prolific event of the year for R6 esports, was upon us. And within the top 20 teams in the world were 3 Europeans. G2, who were the previous victors of the 6 Invitational at 2023, Wolves, who are an extremely inconsistent powerhouse, and finally Virtus.pro, the current champions of EUL. In Group A, we saw what was probably one of the most heavily contested groups on paper, containing G2, DZ, NIP, FearX, and Geekay. But G2 proved everyone wrong, and 2-0'd everyone in their best of 3 groups with relatively standard levels of effort, considering most teams hide their big strats inside of groups. In Group B, however, we saw a much closer affair, as Wolves were pitted off against SSG, FaZe, Bliss, and DK. Wolves struggled in day 1, eventually securing a win against the Rising Stars of SSG, before beating Bliss and DK with relative ease, before losing outright to FaZe Clan. The final group of the 4 to have a European roster was Group C. Virtus.pro. The Russian Titans had what was far and away the strongest group in this entire phase, facing off against rising stars such as Bleed, regional champions such as M80, and W7M. W7M at this point won the last 2 major events, and long-standing titans such as Team Liquid. The only map won with ease in this group for VP was against M80, and the only loss for VP was against Team Liquid, with every game going to all 3 maps except the match against M80, making for the most entertaining group of the lot. Differentiating from the previous major event, the 6 Invitational was only split into 2 phases. A points-based groups phase and the playoffs, where the top 12 teams face off in a double bracket format, with the top teams from each group automatically qualifying to the upper bracket round 2 immediately. With 8 of the 12 remaining rosters, each competing against each other to decide who moves on to fight the top 4 of the tournament so far, whilst the 4th place teams of each group were left to compete starting from the lower bracket. Wolves started out the tournament in upper bracket round 1, beating the Brazilian regional champions of W7M in a 2-1 fun and exhilarating best of 3 matchup, before then shitting the bed against Sonics 2-0 and losing to Bliss in lower bracket round 2, therefore eliminating them from the tournament as a whole. G2, however, re-attempted their Cinderella story from SI 2023, where they won the tournament starting from the lower bracket. However, this time, they lost to FaZe in upper bracket round 2, dropping them to face Team Liquid in lower bracket round 2, securing 3 consecutive 2-0 wins in a row against Liquid, Bliss, and DZ before eventually getting 2-0'd themselves by W7M. Finally, Virtus.pro, also starting in upper bracket round 2, managed to beat NIP and DZ before eventually facing FaZe in the upper bracket finals, where they got bent over and spanked by the Brazilian trickshotters. Once in the lower bracket finals, they found themselves within the crosshairs of the Brazilian juggernaut of W7M. The reigning major champions of W7M faced off in a head-to-head of regional top dogs. Both teams traded the first 2 maps 7-4 going both ways before eventually making their way to Border, where we would see the most even map of the entire tournament, In the first round of overtime, we saw Joystick ace against the Brazilians, asserting his dominance and fueling the entire European region with hot and heavy doses of copium, until W7M took the next 2 rounds in a row pretty methodically, and then eventually knocked the last European hope out of the tournament. EUL 2024 Stage 1. Though it's already commenced, the link to the Liquipedia page to see how it's going will be in the description below. In EUL, the changes we see are as follows. Heroic, M&M, and Koi will be stepping away from R6 for the foreseeable future, dropping their rosters and coaching staff into the pool of free agents that we already have within the EUL. G2, Virtus Pro, and Wolves will be making 0 changes to their rosters and coaching staff, ready to continue to do and perform so much better than they did prior to this point. BDS will be suffering the loss of Renshiro as he retires from R6 competitive after his long-standing and ever-present tour of the EUL, retiring in quotation marks. They will also be losing Elems due to some minor issues that have allegedly surfaced. Team Secret will be replacing Falls and Upor due to reasons unbeknownst to me, and replacing them with ex-heroic IGL Doom alongside Adrian. Fnatic will be entering as the new roster, filling a much needed gap within the back end of EUL, picking up the Koi core of Deepek, Leon Gids, and Jigsaw, who will be joined by Jegs and the current best of 5 kill record holder of Tyrant from the ex-M&M roster. ITB will be losing Kanto Raketti and Jonka and replacing them with up-and-comers Creeds and Oscar. Wild have replaced Jegs and Hungry as Hungry retires and Jegs is poached. They also lost aces upon recent cheating allegations, and their new players being Kanto Raketti, Nello and Lolo, to fill out their roster in the return to EUL. Finally, we see a return from the organisation of ENCE, originally created as a joke team used to allow the original Finnish 5 to compete at the highest levels. After that though, they dropped out of the scene and continued on as a real organisation elsewhere, but now they return to the R6 competitive scene after hand-picking Team Valor's roster to bring them from T2 to T1 after their performance in the Malta Cyber Series. I hope this helped you understand the up-and-coming season of EUL just a little bit better. And in the wise words of the Kid Leroy, fuck you, goodbye.